There's a very specific kind of regret almost nobody warns people about. Not regret over losing an empath's love, which we've covered before, but something sharper, more immediate, more practically devastating. The regret of discovering, too late, exactly what an empath's calm actually protected you from. Today we're talking about what happens the moment an empath finally, genuinely breaks, not their heart, not their patience in the emotional sense we've discussed before, but something structural, something functional, something that quietly held an entire system of people together invisibly until the moment it stopped. Let's set up something important before going further, because this episode approaches the topic from an angle we haven't covered yet in this series. What an empath's presence actually does, structurally, for the people and systems around them, and what specifically breaks mechanically once that presence is finally withdrawn. Here's the first thing worth understanding. An empath in almost any group they're part of, a family, a friend group, a workplace, tends to occupy an unofficial, unpaid, unacknowledged role that most people never consciously notice exists until it's gone. They absorb tension before it escalates. They translate between people who communicate differently, smoothing misunderstandings before those misunderstandings become genuine conflicts. They notice the person in the room who's struggling silently and quietly, redirect attention or resources toward them, often without anyone else ever realizing an intervention even happened. They remember details other people forget, anticipate needs other people miss, and generally function as a kind of invisible infrastructure holding an entire system together. The way plumbing holds a house together, utterly essential, completely unnoticed, until the exact moment it fails. This is the first reason the eventual breaking of an empath produces consequences so much more severe than people expect. Nobody in the system actually knows how much load-bearing work was happening because that work was specifically designed by the empath's own nature to be invisible. Unlike a manager whose departure gets announced, whose responsibilities get formally redistributed, an empath's role in a family or friend group has no job description, no formal handoff, no acknowledgement that a specific set of functions existed at all until those functions simply stop happening. Let's talk about what actually breaks when an empath finally, genuinely withdraws this function, not through a single dramatic exit, but through the slow, cumulative decision to simply stop performing the invisible labor that's been holding everything together. The first thing that breaks? Conflict that used to get intercepted and diffused before it ever became visible now reaches full, unmediated intensity because the person who used to absorb and redirect tension before it escalated has stopped doing that specific work. Family gatherings that used to run smoothly, seemingly by magic, start producing actual arguments, actual visible conflict, actual discomfort that everyone present now has to navigate directly without the buffer that used to exist. This often produces genuine confusion among the people experiencing it. Why does everything suddenly feel so much harder, so much more volatile, when nothing about the actual underlying tensions has changed? The answer, almost always, is that something that used to catch and diffuse this tension before it became visible has simply stopped catching it. The second thing that breaks, information that used to flow smoothly between people who don't communicate well directly now stops flowing at all. Because the empath who used to serve as translator, as go-between, as the person who could accurately convey one family member's actual meaning to another family member who consistently misread their tone, has stopped performing that specific function. Relationships that were never actually healthy on their own terms, but that functioned adequately because of this constant, invisible translation, start deteriorating rapidly, sometimes within weeks, because the translation layer that made them workable has simply been removed. The third thing that breaks, and one of the more painful ones to witness, people who were quietly struggling and who were being quietly supported by an empath's constant, low-grade monitoring and intervention suddenly find themselves without any safety net at all, often without immediately understanding why their situation has become noticeably harder. A family member managing a difficult period, a friend going through something they haven't fully disclosed, a colleague barely keeping their head above water. All of these people were often receiving real, substantive support from an empath's constant attention, support that was never formally acknowledged as support because it happened so quietly, so consistently, that it simply blended into the ordinary texture of the relationship rather than standing out as a distinct, nameable form of care. The fourth thing that breaks, the specific quality of group cohesion that comes from someone consistently, actively working to keep everyone feeling included, remembered, and valued, rather than simply hoping that cohesion happens naturally. Friend groups, families, even workplace teams often have exactly one person quietly doing this work, remembering birthdays, checking in on people who've gone quiet, making sure nobody feels forgotten during a busy season. Once this person stops, the group doesn't simply continue functioning at the same level with one less contributor. It often fragments considerably faster than anyone would have predicted, because the cohesion was never actually distributed evenly across the group in the first place. It was being actively, continuously generated by one specific person and removed from its actual source. That cohesion doesn't simply persist on its own momentum for very long. I want to talk about why people are so consistently, genuinely surprised by how severe these consequences turn out to be, because this surprise itself reveals something important about how invisible this labor actually was. Most people, in the months or even years leading up to an empath's eventual breaking point, have no accurate sense of how much they've actually been relying on this specific person's constant, quiet intervention. They experience the empath's care as simply how things are, rather than as an active, ongoing, effortful choice being made continuously, day after day, that could at any point actually stop. This means the eventual withdrawal feels, from the perspective of everyone else in the system, less like a predictable consequence of years of taking someone for granted, and more like a sudden, inexplicable collapse of something that used to simply work on its own. I want to say something important about why this specific framing, structural, functional consequences, rather than purely emotional ones, matters differently than what we've covered in earlier episodes on similar topics. Emotional consequences, the kind we've discussed before, tend to unfold slowly, internally, often invisible even to the person experiencing them until much later. Structural consequences, the kind we're describing today, tend to become visible far more quickly and far more undeniably, because they show up as actual, observable changes in how a family functions, how a friend group holds together, how a workplace operates. This means the regret referenced in this episode's title often arrives much faster than the regret we've discussed in other episodes about hurt empaths. Not years later, in a private moment of quiet realization, but within weeks or months, as an entire system that used to run smoothly, suddenly, visibly, starts falling apart in ways that are impossible to ignore or explain away. I want to be honest about something before we move into the second half of this conversation, because it matters for how this information gets used. Understanding this mechanism isn't about villainizing the people who benefited from an empath's invisible labor without acknowledging it. In most cases, this benefit happens unconsciously, without any deliberate intention to exploit or take advantage. It's simply what happens when one person's consistent, quiet effort becomes so reliable that everyone around them stops noticing it as effort at all. But unconscious or not, the consequences of its withdrawal are entirely real, entirely predictable once you understand the mechanism, and entirely worth understanding clearly, whether you're the empath whose breaking point is approaching or someone who's just beginning to realize how much invisible structure they've actually been relying on. And that's exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. What actually happens specifically in the weeks and months immediately following an empath's genuine withdrawal of this invisible labor, why some systems eventually adapt and rebuild while others never fully recover, and why understanding this entire mechanism matters as much for the empath themselves as it does for everyone who's been quietly, invisibly depending on them. Let's talk about what actually happens, specifically, in the weeks and months immediately following an empath's genuine withdrawal of this invisible labor, because the unfolding tends to follow a remarkably consistent pattern, one that explains both why some systems eventually adapt and rebuild and why others never fully recover. Here's the first phase, and it's usually the shortest, a period of genuine confusion, where the people affected notice something has changed, but can't yet identify what. Arguments happen that wouldn't have happened before. Communication that used to flow smoothly starts producing misunderstandings. People who used to feel remembered and included start feeling, without quite being able to name why, slightly more forgotten, slightly more alone. This phase is often marked by a kind of generalized, free-floating discomfort rather than any specific, articulated complaint, because the actual cause, the removal of consistent, invisible mediation, hasn't yet been consciously identified by anyone experiencing its absence. The second phase, and often the most volatile, a scramble to restore the previous equilibrium, usually directed at least initially at the empath themselves, in the hope that whatever's changed can simply be reversed through enough pressure or enough appeal. This is where a lot of the more painful dynamics we've discussed in earlier episodes tend to surface: guilt-tripping, appeals to history and loyalty, sometimes genuine confusion mixed with genuine hurt at what feels to the people affected like an inexplicable withdrawal of care. This phase can be genuinely difficult for an empath to hold steady through, precisely because the people applying this pressure often aren't being malicious. They're genuinely confused, genuinely missing something they never understood they were receiving, and their distress, however much it stems from their own years of taking that labor for granted, can feel real and compelling enough to pull an empath back into resuming the old pattern, undoing the entire withdrawal before it has a chance to actually produce any lasting change in how the system functions. The third phase, assuming the empath holds through the second phase without reverting, is where the actual structural adaptation either begins or fails to begin, a genuine reckoning among the people affected with the fact that the previous equilibrium isn't coming back and that something new will have to be built in its place. This phase is where the outcome genuinely diverges, depending heavily on the specific people and systems involved, and it's worth walking through what determines which direction any given system actually goes. Here's the first factor that determines whether a system successfully adapts, rather than simply continuing to deteriorate: whether at least one other person within the system is capable of, and willing to, begin developing some version of the skills the empath used to provide. Not replicating them exactly, which is rarely possible, but developing enough capacity for direct communication, enough willingness to actually address tension rather than relying on someone else to quietly absorb it, that the system can function through a fundamentally different mechanism than it used to. Systems with at least one person capable of this kind of growth tend to eventually stabilize into something new, often less smooth and less effortless than what the empath used to provide, but genuinely functional on its own terms. Systems without anyone capable of or willing to develop this capacity tend to simply continue deteriorating, sometimes for years, never actually replacing what was lost, because relying on someone else to eventually solve the problem was always easier than developing the capacity to solve it themselves. The second factor, whether the people affected are actually willing to have direct, honest conversations about what's changed, rather than simply experiencing the deterioration passively and attributing it to vague, unexamined causes. Things have just been harder lately. We don't get along as well as we used to, without ever connecting the change to its actual, specific origin. Systems capable of this kind of honest examination tend to eventually understand what's actually happened, which is often the necessary first step before genuine adaptation can occur. Systems that avoid this kind of direct examination tend to simply experience ongoing, unexplained difficulty without ever developing the accurate understanding required to actually address it. The third factor, and often the most significant, whether the empath, having withdrawn this labor, is subsequently treated with genuine respect and appreciation for what they'd previously been providing, or whether the system's primary response remains focused on trying to pressure them back into resuming the old pattern rather than genuinely reckoning with what's changed. Systems that shift toward genuine appreciation and respect, sometimes only after significant uncomfortable disruption forces this shift, occasionally succeed in rebuilding a relationship with the empath that's actually healthier than what existed before, one where the previously invisible labor becomes acknowledged, sometimes even partially reciprocated, rather than simply assumed. Systems that never make this shift, continuing to treat the empath's withdrawal purely as a problem to be solved through renewed pressure rather than genuine understanding, tend to lose that empath's investment permanently, regardless of how much the surrounding structure continues to struggle in their absence. I want to say something important about why this third factor matters so much for the empath's own decision-making, because it's genuinely relevant information, not simply a description of what happens to everyone else. If you're an empath currently approaching or moving through this exact process, watching how the people around you respond to the initial disruption tells you something important about whether reinvestment, even partial reinvestment, would ever actually be worthwhile. A system that responds to disruption with genuine reflection and appreciation is signaling something different than a system that responds purely with pressure and appeals to guilt. And that difference matters enormously for whether the relationship going forward could ever actually become something more sustainable than what existed before your withdrawal began. I want to close this out with something important about the empath's own experience during this entire process, because it's easy, in an episode focused on structural consequences to everyone else, to lose sight of what this withdrawal actually costs the person doing it. Watching a system you've spent years quietly holding together begin visibly struggling, even when that struggling is a direct, predictable consequence of years of being taken for granted, is genuinely difficult to witness, even when the withdrawal itself was necessary and correct. This difficulty deserves acknowledgement, not dismissal, and it's worth naming clearly. Choosing to stop absorbing tension you were never actually responsible for absorbing doesn't automatically make watching the resulting difficulty easy, even when you know, intellectually, that the difficulty was always going to surface eventually, one way or another, regardless of when you finally stop delaying it through your own continued effort. I want to leave you with an image because I think it captures everything we've walked through across both halves of this episode. Picture an old stone bridge, spanning a river that's been crossed by an entire community for generations, so reliably, so consistently, that nobody currently alive actually remembers it ever needing repair, or ever requiring any conscious thought about its structural integrity at all. People walk across it daily, carrying groceries, children, entire lives back and forth across that river without a single thought given to the actual engineering holding it up, because it has simply always been there, always solid, always trustworthy, exactly the way bridges are supposed to be. What almost nobody in this community knows is that this bridge has never actually been structurally self-sufficient. There's a single, load-bearing support hidden beneath the water's surface, invisible to anyone walking across the top, that has been quietly, continuously reinforced by one specific person for years. Someone who noticed early on a weakness nobody else could see, and who took it upon themselves, without any formal request, without any acknowledgement, to keep that support functional through constant unseen maintenance that nobody above the waterline ever had reason to notice or thank them for. And then, one day, exhausted from years of unacknowledged, unpaid labor, holding up a structure everyone else assumed was simply permanently solid on its own, this person finally, quietly, stops. The bridge doesn't collapse immediately. Stone doesn't crumble overnight. But cracks that used to get addressed before they became visible now spread slowly, unaddressed, and the entire community, still walking across every single day without a second thought, starts to notice something they can't quite name, a slight unevenness underfoot, a groaning sound they've never heard before, a growing, unexplained anxiety about a structure they used to trust completely without ever examining why. Some communities, once this begins, eventually send someone down to actually look, to finally understand what's been holding the bridge together this entire time, and to begin the difficult, necessary work of learning to maintain it themselves, or of properly, finally, honoring and compensating the person who's been doing it invisibly for so long. These communities eventually rebuild something that actually holds. Other communities simply keep walking across, blaming the wind, blaming bad luck, blaming anything except the actual specific absence of the person who used to hold everything together beneath the surface, and their bridge, slowly, predictably, continues to weaken, never actually repaired, because nobody within that community was ever willing to look down beneath the water to understand what they'd actually lost. Either way, the person who spent years holding up that bridge alone, invisible, and unacknowledged, was never actually obligated to keep doing so indefinitely, regardless of what eventually happens to a structure they never should have had to maintain entirely alone in the first place.